At 3:47 p.m. on September 20th, 1944, Major Charles Carpenter dove his tiny Piper L-4 Grasshopper toward a German Panther tank near the town of Aricourt in eastern France. The fabric-covered observation plane had no business attacking a 40-ton tank armed with a 75mm cannon, but strapped to each wing strut were 3 M9A1 bazooka rocket launchers, giving this unarmed spotter plane the firepower of an infantry squad. Carpenter fired 2 rockets at 200 feet, both streaking toward the Panther in trails of white smoke. The first rocket struck the tank's turret ring, and the second hit the engine deck, detonating the ammunition inside. The Panther exploded in a massive fireball as Carpenter pulled up hard, his fragile plane buffeted by the blast. This was Major Carpenter's 4th tank kill in 2 weeks, and the Army brass thought he was completely insane. Carpenter was a 36-year-old artillery spotter pilot who decided that watching German tanks kill American soldiers wasn't enough. He was going to arm his tiny observation plane and hunt tanks himself, regulations be damned. By the end of the war, Bazooka Charlie would destroy 6 German tanks and multiple armored vehicles, using nothing but a civilian sport plane and infantry weapons. This is the story of how one pilot's unauthorized weapon modification turned a reconnaissance aircraft into a tank killer. Charles Joseph Carpenter was born in 1912 in Moline, Illinois, and grew up working in his father's small manufacturing business. He learned to fly in 1936, earning his private pilot's license in a Piper Cub at a local grass strip. Carpenter loved flying, but pursued a career teaching high school history and coaching basketball in Sterling, Illinois. When World War II started, Carpenter was 30 years old with a wife and 2 children, too old for combat pilot training. But in 1942, the Army started recruiting civilian pilots for artillery spotting duties in observation aircraft. These pilots would fly slow, unarmed planes over battlefields, directing artillery fire onto enemy positions. It was dangerous work, but it didn't require the physical conditioning of fighter pilots, so older men were accepted. Carpenter enlisted in the Army in November 1942 and was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant in the field artillery. He attended artillery spotter training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, learning to direct fire missions from slow-flying L-4 Grasshoppers. The Piper L-4 Grasshopper was the military version of the civilian Piper J-3 Cub, America's most popular training aircraft. It was a tiny 2-seat tandem aircraft with a fabric-covered steel tube fuselage and a 65-horsepower engine. The L-4 cruised at about 75 miles per hour and could barely exceed 85 mph in a dive. It had no armor, no weapons, no radio navigation equipment, just a compass and a map. But it could take off and land in 300 feet, operate from roads or fields, and fly so slowly that enemy fighters had trouble attacking it. Artillery spotters would circle over battlefields at 1,000 feet, radioing coordinates to artillery batteries miles behind the lines. They'd observe shell impacts and adjust fire until rounds landed on target, then call fire for effect to saturate the area. It was essential work that saved countless infantry lives, but spotter pilots could only watch, never shoot. Carpenter arrived in England in March 1944 and was assigned to the 4th Armoured Division's artillery. He flew his first combat missions during the Normandy breakout in July, spotting for artillery during the push across France. By August 1944, he'd been promoted to major and was commanding the division's L-4 spotter flights. The 4th Armoured Division was one of General Patton's spearhead units racing across France toward the German border. But by September, the division was encountering heavy German armor as the Wehrmacht fought to defend the Reich. Carpenter found himself circling over tank battles, watching German Panthers and Tigers destroy American Shermans. The German tanks had thicker armor and more powerful guns, giving them a decisive advantage in direct combat. American tank crews fought bravely, but died in burning Shermans because they couldn't penetrate German armor. Carpenter would call in artillery fire on German tanks, but by the time shells arrived, the tanks had often moved. Tank battles were fast and fluid, and the minutes it took to adjust artillery fire let German armor escape. After watching one particularly brutal engagement, where his division lost 6 Shermans to 2 Panthers, Carpenter had an idea. What if he could attack the tanks directly, instead of calling in artillery? The L-4 was unarmed, but infantry soldiers carried M9A1 bazookas that could destroy tanks at close range. The bazooka fired a 3.5-pound high-explosive anti-tank rocket that could penetrate 4 inches of armor. Tank armor was thickest at the front, but much thinner on top where designers never expected attacks. If Carpenter could dive on tanks from above and fire bazookas at their thin top armor, he might be able to kill them. The idea was completely contrary to regulations, doctrine, and common sense. L-4s were reconnaissance aircraft, not attack planes, and they had no mounting points for weapons. But Carpenter was frustrated watching American soldiers die when he could see the enemy tanks clearly from above. On September 3, 1944, Carpenter visited an infantry unit and borrowed 3 M9A1 bazooka launchers. He took them to his mechanic, Corporal Melvin Davis, and asked if Davis could mount them on his L-4. Davis stared at Carpenter for a long moment, probably thinking his commanding officer had lost his mind. But Davis was a good mechanic who understood that field modifications sometimes saved lives. The two men examined the L-4's wing struts, the diagonal supports that braced the wings to the fuselage. The struts were made of steel tubing strong enough to handle flight loads, possibly strong enough to support weapons. Carpenter and Davis spent 2 days fabricating simple clamp brackets from sheet metal and hardware. They attached 3 bazooka tubes to each wing strut, 6 rockets total, angled slightly downward. The bazookas were positioned so their exhaust would clear the aircraft structure when fired. Carpenter rigged a firing system, using standard electrical wire running into the cockpit. He connected the wires to a makeshift switch panel with 6 buttons, 1 for each rocket. When he pressed a button, electrical current would flow to the rocket's igniter, launching it. The entire modification used maybe $30 worth of hardware and took 12 hours to install. Carpenter test flew the modified L-4 on September 5th, cautiously checking how the added weight affected handling. The 6 loaded bazooka tubes added about 60 pounds total, roughly the weight of a passenger. The aircraft flew normally, maybe slightly heavier on the controls, but still perfectly manageable. Carpenter found an empty field and made a test firing, pressing 1 button while in level flight. The rocket whooshed away from the wing in a trail of smoke, and the L-4 bucked slightly from the recoil. But the aircraft remained controllable, and more importantly, it didn't catch fire from the rocket exhaust. Carpenter fired a second rocket to verify the system worked reliably, then landed to reload. His improvised weapon system functioned. Now he needed to test it against an actual armored target. On September 7th, Carpenter found a destroyed German half-track sitting in a field near the front lines. He circled the wreck, diving from 1,000 feet and firing 1 rocket at about 200 feet altitude. The rocket struck the half-track's hull and detonated, blowing a hole through the armor plate. Carpenter was elated. His jury-rigged weapon system could penetrate armor from the air. He spent the next week practicing dive angles and firing techniques on abandoned vehicles. He learned that diving at about 30 degrees and releasing at 200 to 300 feet gave best accuracy. The bazooka rockets had no guidance, so hitting a target required precise aiming and steady nerves. Carpenter was flying a 75mm fabric-covered plane into anti-aircraft fire to shoot rockets at tanks. If the tanks shot back, a single machine gun burst would shred his aircraft like tissue paper. But Carpenter had watched too many American soldiers die, and he was determined to do something about it. On September 20th, 1944, Major Carpenter got his chance to test his weapon system in actual combat. The 4th Armored Division was engaged in a major tank battle near Aracourt against German armored formations. Carpenter was spotting for artillery when he saw a Panther tank maneuvering to ambush a column of American Shermans. The Panther was in a tree line where artillery would be ineffective, but it had a clear shot at the American tanks. Carpenter radioed the Shermans to warn them, but they couldn't see the Panther through the trees. He watched the Panther's turret traverse toward the lead Sherman, seconds away from firing. Carpenter made a split-second decision, pushed the stick forward and dove toward the Panther. The L-4 dropped from 200 feet in a steep dive, engine screaming, fabric wings shaking. At 300 feet, Carpenter steadied his aim and pressed 2 buttons simultaneously. 2 rockets streaked from his wings, white smoke trails converging on the Panther below. The first rocket hit the turret, and the second struck the engine deck. The Panther's ammunition exploded in a massive fireball, the turret blowing off and landing 20 yards away. Carpenter pulled up hard, his aircraft buffeted by the explosion's shockwave and heated air. He'd just destroyed a 40-ton tank using a 1,100-pound observation plane and 2 infantry rockets. The Sherman crews radioed frantically asking what happened, and Carpenter calmly reported engaging the enemy tank. When Carpenter landed back at his airstrip, word of his tank kill had already spread through the division. Soldiers crowded around his L-4, staring at the remaining 4 bazooka tubes on the wings. The division's commanding officer, Major General John Wood, summoned Carpenter to his command post. Carpenter expected to be disciplined for unauthorized weapons modifications and unauthorized combat engagement. Instead, General Wood asked him how many more tanks he thought he could kill. Wood explained that the 4th Armored was facing superior German armor and needed every advantage. If Carpenter could attack tanks from the air, Wood would authorize the modification and provide support. Wood made it clear this was dangerous and probably insane, but it might save American tankers' lives. Carpenter said he'd keep flying as long as the infantry kept supplying him with bazooka rockets. Over the next 3 weeks, Carpenter flew armed missions almost daily, hunting German armor. He developed tactics for attacking tanks, approaching from sun angles, using terrain for concealment until the last moment. The L-4's slow speed was actually an advantage, because German tank crews expected fast-moving fighter bombers. They'd see Carpenter's fabric-covered spotter plane and assume it was harmless until rockets suddenly appeared. On September 27th, Carpenter destroyed 2 German armored cars using single rocket hits each. On October 4th, he attacked a Panzer IV tank and scored a mobility kill, blowing off its track. The damaged tank was later destroyed by American artillery, directed by another spotter. Carpenter's tactics spread, and several other L-4 pilots in the division armed their aircraft with bazookas. But Carpenter was the most aggressive and most successful, earning the nickname Bazooka Charlie from infantry troops. German troops began calling him that crazy American in the fabric plane with rockets. They issued warnings about low-flying observation aircraft that should be engaged immediately with all available weapons. On October 9, 1944, Carpenter found a German Tiger tank moving alone down a forest road. The Tiger was the most feared tank in the German arsenal, with armor thick enough to shrug off most American weapons. But even a Tiger's top armor was vulnerable to bazooka rockets fired from directly above. Carpenter dove from 2,500 feet, coming almost straight down to hit the Tiger's engine deck. He fired 3 rockets in rapid succession, pulling up so hard the L-4's fabric skin groaned from the G-forces. 2 rockets hit the Tiger's rear deck where the engine was located, and the 3rd hit the turret rear. The Tiger stopped moving, thick black smoke pouring from the engine compartment. Carpenter circled once to assess damage, saw crew members bailing out, and knew the Tiger was finished. He'd just killed the most powerful tank in the German military, using a plane that weighed less than the tank's ammunition load. The story of Bazooka Charlie spread through American and German forces alike. American infantry troops loved him because he was directly engaging the tanks that terrorized them. German tank crews hated him because they couldn't predict when a seemingly harmless spotter plane would suddenly attack. The psychological impact was significant. German tankers couldn't ignore any aircraft, even slow observation planes. This forced them to button up hatches and stay alert, reducing their tactical effectiveness. By late October 1944, Carpenter had confirmed kills on 5 tanks and multiple light-armored vehicles. He'd also conducted dozens of attacks on German supply trucks, troop concentrations, and artillery positions. His L-4 had been hit by ground fire 3 times, the fabric skin patched with tape and dope. 1 bullet had passed through the cockpit, between Carpenter and his observer, without hitting either man. Carpenter knew his luck couldn't hold forever, but he kept flying armed missions. The Army Air Force headquarters learned about Carpenter's activities in November 1944. Staff officers were horrified that an unarmed observation aircraft was being used for ground attack. They sent inspectors to the 4th Armored Division to investigate this unauthorized weapons modification. The inspectors examined Carpenter's L-4 and concluded the bazooka installation was mechanically sound. The clamps were secure, the wiring was properly insulated, and the installation didn't compromise flight safety. But using an L-4 for ground attack violated doctrine, regulations, and probably common sense. The inspectors recommended that Carpenter be ordered to remove the weapons and return to normal spotting duties. General Wood intervened, arguing that Carpenter's attacks were providing valuable tactical support. Wood provided data showing that Carpenter's presence had measurably reduced German tank effectiveness in the division's sector. German tanks were more cautious, moved less aggressively, and were easier for American armor to engage. Wood argued that Carpenter was providing close air support more effective than calling in fighter bombers. Fighter bombers took hours to coordinate and often arrived after German armor had moved. Carpenter was overhead constantly and could attack targets of opportunity within seconds of identification. The Army Air Force reluctantly agreed to allow Carpenter to continue his armed missions. But they stipulated this was an experimental field modification, not a doctrinal change. Other L-4 units were not authorized to arm their aircraft without explicit approval. This restriction was ignored, and by December 1944, several dozen L-4s across Europe carried bazookas. Most used Carpenter's basic mounting system, refined slightly by unit mechanics. The armed L-4s became known as Grasshopper gunships among the troops. In December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge began with a massive German counteroffensive. The 4th Armored Division was rushed north to help relieve besieged American forces at Bastogne. Carpenter flew reconnaissance missions in terrible weather, often the only aircraft that could operate. Fighter bombers were grounded by fog and low clouds, but Carpenter's L-4 could fly beneath the weather. He spotted German armor movements and attacked when opportunities appeared, despite intense ground fire. On December 26, during the push to Bastogne, Carpenter attacked a German tank column with his remaining 4 rockets. He destroyed one Panzer IV and damaged a second, disrupting the column long enough for American artillery to engage. This was Carpenter's 6th and final confirmed tank kill of the war. By January 1945, the German offensive was collapsing and Allied forces were advancing again. Carpenter continued flying armed missions, but German armor was becoming scarce as fuel shortages crippled Wehrmacht operations. He shifted to attacking trucks, railroad cars and troop concentrations with his bazooka rockets. In February 1945, Carpenter's L-4 was badly damaged by anti-aircraft fire during an attack on a German supply convoy. Multiple 20mm shells hit the fuselage and wings, one passing through the cockpit and destroying his radio. Carpenter managed to nurse the crippled aircraft back to friendly territory and crash-landed in a field. He walked away with minor injuries, but his L-4 was a total loss, the fabric skin shredded by shrapnel. Carpenter was grounded for 2 weeks, while a replacement aircraft was located and armed with bazookas. By the time he returned to flying in March, the war in Europe was clearly entering its final phase. Carpenter flew his last combat mission on April 19, 1945, attacking a German defensive position with rockets. When Germany surrendered on May 8th, Carpenter had logged over 600 combat hours in his armed L-4. His confirmed combat record included 6 tanks destroyed, multiple armored vehicles, and dozens of trucks and guns. More importantly, his tactics had demonstrated that even the smallest aircraft could be effective attack platforms. Major Charles Carpenter received the Silver Star for gallantry in action, specifically citing his tank-killing missions. The citation noted that he'd engaged enemy armor using unauthorized weapons on an unarmed reconnaissance aircraft. This was possibly the only military decoration ever awarded for violating regulations to attack tanks in a fabric-covered sport plane. Carpenter also received the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with Clusters, and the French Croix de Guerre. After the war, Carpenter returned to Illinois and resumed teaching high school history. He rarely talked about his wartime experiences, preferring to focus on his students and family. When people asked about his military service, he'd mention he was an artillery spotter in Europe. He didn't usually mention the bazookas unless pressed, saying it had just seemed like a practical solution. Carpenter died in 1966 at age 54 from a heart attack while coaching a basketball game. His obituary mentioned his military service, but focused primarily on his 40 years as an educator. It wasn't until years later that military historians began documenting the Bazooka Charlie story in detail. Carpenter's L-4 Grasshopper was donated to a museum after the war, but was lost in a fire in the 1950s. No authentic Bazooka Charlie aircraft survives, though several have been recreated for museums and airshows. The impact of Carpenter's innovation extended beyond his personal combat record. His success demonstrated that light aircraft could perform ground attack missions if properly armed. This concept influenced post-war development of armed observation and light attack aircraft. The Korean War saw extensive use of armed L-4s and L-19s, attacking ground targets with rockets and machine guns. Vietnam brought the concept to full maturity, with aircraft like the O-1 Bird Dog carrying rockets and guns for close support. Modern light attack aircraft and armed drones trace their conceptual lineage partly to Carpenter's improvised weapons. The idea that any aircraft could become an attack platform, if the mission required it, became accepted doctrine. Carpenter proved that innovation and adaptability mattered more than following rigid equipment classifications. The technical aspects of Carpenter's bazooka installation are worth examining in detail. The M9A1 bazooka was originally designed as a shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon for infantry. It weighed 15 pounds loaded and fired a 3.5-pound rocket to ranges of about 300 yards. The rocket traveled at roughly 300 feet per second, much slower than artillery shells. This low velocity made accuracy challenging, especially from a moving aircraft platform. Carpenter compensated by diving steeply and firing at close range, typically 200 to 300 feet. At this range, the rocket's flight time was less than a second, minimizing aim error. The L-4's slow speed actually helped accuracy, because relative velocity between aircraft and target was low. A fighter bomber diving at 300 mph had to lead targets significantly and often missed. Carpenter's L-4 diving at 80 mph was almost hovering compared to jets, making aiming simpler. The bazooka rocket's shaped charge warhead could penetrate 4 inches of steel armor. Tank armor was thickest at the front, up to 6 inches on Panthers and 8 inches on Tigers. But top armor was typically 1 to 2 inches, because designers never expected attacks from above. Carpenter's dive attacks hit this weak top armor, making even the heaviest tanks vulnerable. Engine compartment hits were particularly effective because fuel and ammunition were stored there. A single rocket penetrating the engine deck could trigger catastrophic secondary explosions. This is what happened with Carpenter's Panther and Tiger kills. The initial rocket ignited internal fuel or ammunition. Carpenter's mounting system was mechanically simple, but effective. The sheet metal clamps held the bazooka tubes rigidly to prevent them from shifting during flight. The electrical firing system was more sophisticated than it appeared, requiring careful insulation to prevent shorts. Carpenter used automotive wire protected by rubber tubing, routing it carefully to avoid control cable interference. The switch panel in the cockpit was mounted within easy reach so he could fire while controlling the aircraft. Each rocket was fired individually rather than in salvos, giving Carpenter maximum flexibility. He could adjust aim between shots or save rockets if the first hit achieved the desired effect. The weight and drag of 6 loaded bazookas reduced the L-4's performance measurably. Cruise speed dropped from 75 mph to about 70 meter, and rate of climb decreased by roughly 20%. But the L-4's performance margins were so generous that these reductions didn't seriously affect operations. The aircraft could still take off from short fields and maintain adequate maneuverability for reconnaissance work. After firing all 6 rockets, the L-4's performance actually improved because it was 60 pounds lighter. Carpenter would sometimes fire all his rockets early in a mission to reduce weight for later maneuvering. The biggest challenge with the armed L-4 was reloading, which required ground crew assistance. Each rocket had to be carefully inserted into its tube and the electrical connection verified. Early in Carpenter's operations, reloading took about 30 minutes per aircraft. As crews gained experience, they reduced this to about 15 minutes, allowing faster mission turnaround. The tactical doctrine Carpenter developed for armed L-4 operations became surprisingly sophisticated. He learned to attack from sun angles when possible, making it harder for tank crews to see him approaching. He used terrain masking, flying low behind ridges, then popping up for quick attacks before diving back to cover. He coordinated with ground forces, who would mark targets with smoke or tracer fire. Carpenter learned that German tanks were most vulnerable during movement, when hatches were open for visibility. Stationary tanks with hatches closed were harder to kill, because crews could button up at the first sign of air attack. He developed a preference for attacking tanks that were engaged with American ground forces. Tank crews focused on ground threats often didn't notice the slow-flying L-4 until rockets were already inbound. Carpenter also learned the hard way about German anti-aircraft capabilities around armored formations. Tank columns typically included self-propelled anti-aircraft guns that could shred his fragile aircraft. He had to identify these threats before attacking, and either avoid them or strike from angles where they couldn't engage. The psychological impact of Carpenter's operations extended beyond immediate tactical effects. American ground troops gained confidence, knowing that even small observation planes could hurt enemy armor. This boosted morale and encouraged aggressive tactics because soldiers felt they had effective air support. German tank crews, conversely, became more cautious and defensive. Intelligence reports captured after the war showed German concerns about armed light aircraft. Wehrmacht tactical manuals were updated to warn about American observation planes carrying anti-tank weapons. Tank crews were instructed to maintain airwatch constantly and engage any aircraft immediately. This forced German armor to operate more cautiously, reducing their tactical effectiveness. Some German units assigned dedicated anti-aircraft vehicles to protect tank formations from L-4 attacks. This diverted resources from frontline combat, showing that Carpenter's impact exceeded his direct kill count. The story of Bazooka Charlie illustrates several important principles about military innovation. First, battlefield problems sometimes require unconventional solutions that bypass official doctrine. Carpenter saw American soldiers dying to German armor and improvised a way to help them. He didn't wait for official authorization or engineering studies, he just built what he needed. Second, successful innovation often comes from combining existing technologies in new ways. Carpenter didn't invent new weapons, he just mounted infantry bazookas on an aircraft. The genius was recognizing that this combination could solve a tactical problem. Third, field modifications need supportive leadership to succeed. General Wood could have shut down Carpenter's experiments, but instead provided protection and resources. Wood understood that unconventional solutions were sometimes necessary and was willing to defend them. Fourth, personal courage and acceptance of risk enable innovation. Carpenter risked his life testing unproven weapons on a defenseless aircraft. He could have been killed during any attack, but he believed the risk was worth taking. Fifth, successful innovations often spread organically through frontline units. Other L-4 pilots saw Carpenter's success and armed their own aircraft despite regulations. Good ideas adopted by troops on the ground eventually force official doctrine to catch up. The limitations of Carpenter's approach also deserve acknowledgement. The armed L-4 was effective, but extremely vulnerable to enemy fire. Carpenter survived largely through luck and skill, but many other pilots trying similar tactics were shot down. The fabric-covered L-4 offered no protection against even rifle-caliber bullets. A single hit to the engine or pilot would cause immediate mission failure. The bazooka rockets had limited accuracy and required very close range to be effective. This forced pilots to fly within small arms range, exposing them to intense ground fire. The 6-rocket loadout meant pilots had limited ammunition for extended missions. Once rockets were expended, the L-4 reverted to unarmed reconnaissance duties. Weather and visibility limitations restricted when armed L-4s could operate effectively. Target identification from a slow-moving aircraft at 1,000 feet was challenging in poor conditions. Despite these limitations, Carpenter's concept proved viable under specific tactical circumstances. When fast fighter bombers weren't available or couldn't respond quickly enough, the armed L-4 filled a critical gap. The aircraft's slow speed and ability to loiter made it ideal for responding to fleeting targets. Carpenter's legacy extends beyond his personal combat achievements. He demonstrated that innovation and adaptability were as important as following doctrine. His willingness to experiment with unconventional solutions saved American lives. The armed L-4 concept influenced post-war thinking about light attack aircraft and close air support. Military planners recognized that simple, inexpensive platforms could provide effective fire support. This thinking led to development of dedicated light attack aircraft like the A-1 Skyraider and OV-10 Bronco. Modern armed drones represent the ultimate evolution of Carpenter's concept. Slow-flying platforms with precision weapons, providing persistent close support to ground forces. The technical execution differs vastly, but the tactical concept traces back to pioneers like Carpenter. Museums and airshows occasionally display L-4 Grasshoppers, configured as Bazooka Charlie replicas. These recreations help preserve the story for new generations. The Illinois Aviation Museum maintains an L-4 painted in Carpenter's markings with replica bazooka tubes. The National Museum of World War II Aviation has extensive documentation of Carpenter's missions. The Army Aviation Museum at Fort Rucker includes Carpenter's story in exhibits about observation aircraft evolution. Several documentary films have featured Bazooka Charlie, usually in segments about unusual World War II innovations. Military history channels periodically produce content about Carpenter's unconventional tactics. The story appeals to audiences because it combines technical ingenuity with personal courage. Carpenter wasn't a test pilot or special forces operator. He was a high school teacher who saw a problem and fixed it. His ordinariness makes the story more relatable and inspiring. The technical simplicity of his solution demonstrates that complex problems don't always require complex answers. Sometimes basic tools applied creatively achieve results that sophisticated systems can't. The human element of Carpenter's story resonates across generations. He was a father and teacher who joined the military to serve his country. He could have simply performed his assigned spotting duties safely. Instead, he chose to take enormous personal risks to help soldiers on the ground. This selflessness and initiative exemplify the best qualities of citizen soldiers. Carpenter never sought glory or recognition for his actions. He returned to civilian life and continued teaching, rarely discussing his wartime experiences. This humility makes his achievements more impressive rather than less. The contrast between Carpenter's modest peacetime life and his audacious wartime actions is striking. The same man who attacked Tiger tanks in a fabric plane spent decades teaching teenagers about history. This duality illustrates how ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. As we conclude this story of how Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter mounted anti-tank rockets to a reconnaissance plane, several themes emerge. First, battlefield innovation often comes from seeing problems from fresh perspectives. Carpenter wasn't constrained by doctrine saying observation planes couldn't attack tanks. He simply saw a need and figured out how to meet it using available resources. Second, effective solutions don't require sophisticated technology. Carpenter used hardware store materials to create a weapon system that killed Tiger tanks. Simplicity and practicality often beat complexity and elegance. Third, leadership matters enormously in enabling innovation. General Wood could have shut down Carpenter's experiments, but instead protected and encouraged them. Good leaders recognize when rules need bending to achieve mission success. Fourth, personal courage enables innovation that others consider too risky. Carpenter tested his weapons under combat conditions, accepting that failure meant death. This willingness to accept risk for potential benefit drives military innovation. Fifth, successful field modifications spread organically when they prove effective. Other pilots adopted Carpenter's bazooka installation because it worked, not because orders required it. Bottom-up innovation often precedes top-down doctrinal changes. These principles remain relevant in any field requiring creative problem-solving under pressure. Whether in military operations, business, or technology, the lessons apply. See problems clearly. Design simple solutions, find supportive leadership, accept risk, share successes. Charles Carpenter never intended to become a legend. He just wanted to stop watching American soldiers die to German tanks he could see but couldn't engage. His improvised solution, crude as it was, gave him the capability to help those soldiers. Every tank he destroyed was one less threat to American troops advancing through Europe. Every German tank crew that became cautious because of him was one less aggressive threat. The soldiers who survived because of Bazooka Charlie probably never knew his name. But somewhere in France or Germany, a tank that would have killed them was destroyed by a tiny plane with bazooka tubes. Carpenter's legacy lives in those saved lives and in the principle he demonstrated. That innovation and courage can overcome material disadvantages. That a 1,100-pound fabric plane can kill a 40-ton tank if the pilot is brave enough. That unconventional solutions sometimes work better than conventional ones. The next time you see a small Piper Cub flying overhead, remember Bazooka Charlie. Remember that this civilian sport plane once hunted Tiger tanks across Europe. Remember that innovation doesn't require laboratories or defense contractors. Sometimes it just requires a mechanic, some bazooka tubes, and a pilot willing to try something crazy. Charles Carpenter took a reconnaissance plane and turned it into a tank killer. He saved American lives, destroyed enemy armor, and proved that audacity combined with ingenuity defeats conventional limitations. All from strapping infantry weapons to a plane that weighed less than its targets. That's the power of seeing beyond what's supposed to be possible. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories of innovation and courage from military history. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters, each one deserves recognition, and we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these remarkable stories alive.